All right, let's dive deep into this book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck by Mark Manson. It's a bit provocative, isn't it?
It is, and that's kind of the point.
Hmm.
This book really shakes up the self-help genre. Instead of all that positive thinking stuff, it tells us to get real with, well, reality, limitations, and even death.
Wow. So, um, this deep dive is for people who want to cut through all that BS and figure out what really matters.
Exactly, and get ready for some wild stories and anecdotes along the way.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole death thing. It's a bit heavy, right?
Well, Manson argues that we're all going to die someday, and acknowledging that can actually make our lives better.
Okay, how so?
He talks about this thing called death terror. It's that deep down anxiety we all have about, not existing anymore.
Right, I think we've all felt that at some point.
And it's a big deal. Ernest Becker, this cultural anthropologist, said that this fear of death actually drives a lot of our behavior, like our need for meaning, our desire for significance. We're constantly trying to overcome this fear, even subconsciously.
So it's like we're trying to leave a legacy behind, something that outlasts us.
Exactly. Manson calls these immortality projects the things we hope will give our life lasting value, our values, our beliefs, accomplishments.
But sometimes those projects can get a little distorted, right?
Yeah.
We start chasing external validation instead of what really fulfills us.
Absolutely. And this is where Manson introduces this hilarious concept, the disappointment panda.
Okay, I have to know more about this panda.
Okay, so imagine a panda, a grumpy panda, wearing a superhero cape, going around and delivering harsh truths that nobody wants to hear.
Sounds kind of like my spirit animal. What kind of truth?
Things like, life is full of disappointments, you are not special, you're gonna die someday, like the stuff we usually try to avoid.
So is he just trying to be a downer?
Not at all. It's more about confronting those truths so we can, stop avoiding pain and start focusing on what matters.
Pain. That's not a word we usually associate with self-help.
I know, right? But Manson sees pain differently. He thinks of it as feedback, like a signal telling us something needs to change, something needs to grow.
Can you give an example of that?
Think about physical pain. Like if you touch a hot stove, that pain makes you pull your hand away, prevents you from getting burned worse.
Right, it's a learning experience.
Exactly. Emotional pain is the same way. It shows us where we need to change, to grow, to set boundaries.
Hmm. So are you saying, like, running from pain actually prevents us from reaching our full potential?
It can. Manson believes true happiness comes from solving problems, not from avoiding them.
Really? Isn't happiness about, like, feeling good and avoiding stress?
Well, here's the thing. Problems never really go away. They just kind of morph and change shape.
So we're always going to have some kind of problem to deal with, no matter what.
Pretty much. And that's actually a good thing. It's through those challenges that we learn, we grow, we find meaning.
Okay, but wouldn't it be easier without all that drama?
Maybe, but it would also be pretty dull. Achieving a difficult goal, overcoming obstacles, that's where the real satisfaction comes from.
Sure, there's a definite sense of accomplishment in that.
Exactly. Manson's point is we need to choose our struggles wisely. We shouldn't be wasting energy on things that don't matter. We got to focus on problems that align with our values, that get us closer to the life we want to live.
So how do we even begin to figure out what problems are worth tackling?
That's where Manson's framework for evaluating our values comes in.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more about that framework.
So he says good values, they have to be based in reality, they have to be good for society, and most importantly, they have to be things we can control.
Can you give me a concrete example of a good value?
Sure, take honesty, for example. It's based on truth, right? It helps society, it builds trust, and it's something we can choose to practice every day.
Okay, that makes sense. What about a bad value then? What would that look like?
A bad value would be something like always needing validation from other people. It relies on things outside our control and often leads to anxiety and, insecurity.
It's like building a house on sand that's never going to be stable.
Exactly. And Manson says those bad values, they lead us to the wrong problems.
So give me an example of that. How does a bad value lead to the wrong problem?
Well, imagine someone who always needs to be right. Like, that's their top value. They're going to constantly be arguing, trying to prove their point, even if it hurts their relationship.
Ugh, sounds exhausting.
It is.
Yeah.
Highlights why it's so important to make sure our values are in line with, our actions.
So we got to figure out what we really value if we want to live a good life, make sure those values are leading us in the right direction.
Exactly. And that brings us to another one of Manson's big points, the importance of saying no.
Wait, how does saying no fit into all this?
Well, Manson says every time we say no to something, We're actually saying yes to something else, something more aligned with our values and our goals.
Ah, so it's about setting boundaries, protecting our time and energy.
Exactly. He tells this great story about his travels to Russia to illustrate this point.
Ooh, I love a good travel story. Tell me more.
He was struck by how blunt and honest Russian culture is. People would just tell you their opinions straight up, even if it sounded rude to, like, Western sensibilities.
Wow, that sounds kind of refreshing, honestly. All that sugarcoating we do gets tiring.
It was. And it made Manson realize how powerful it can be to just accept rejection. Instead of always trying to please everyone, he learned to embrace the freedom of saying no.
So it's not about being rude. It's about being authentic and true to yourself, even if it means some people won't like it.
You got it. It's about being brave enough to express yourself, even if you risk disapproval.
I think we all struggle with that, especially now when everyone's telling us what we should be doing and feeling.
And that's where this idea of entitlement comes in. Manson argues that this desire to avoid rejection, it often comes from this belief that we deserve to feel good all the time.
Like we're owed a perfect life, free from any discomfort or disagreement.
Exactly. And that's a recipe for disappointment because, let's face it, life is going to throw curveballs. There will be discomfort, there will be disagreement.
So it's about accepting that things won't always go our way and we'll face rejection, and that's totally okay.
Absolutely. Embracing those experiences is what makes us stronger, more resilient.
Wow, I'm starting to see how all these ideas connect. It's a totally different way of looking at self-improvement.
It is, and there's still so much more to unpack. Manson goes on to talk about how our brains can actually trick us into believing things that aren't even true.
Whoa, now that sounds like a rabbit hole I'm ready to explore.
Buckle up. We're about to enter the world of believing bullshit.
Hmm.
So we were talking about how our brains can actually make us believe things that aren't true.
Oh, right, the whole believing bullshit thing.
Exactly. Manson uses this crazy example of a journalist, Meredith Moran. During therapy, she created this whole elaborate memory of her father abusing her,
Seriously.
and it turned out to be totally made up.
Wow, that's intense. How is that even possible?
Well, see, our brains, they love to make sense of things, to create a coherent story, even if it means bending the truth a bit.
So we basically fill in the gaps with stories,
Yeah.
even if they're not accurate.
Exactly. And that tendency is even stronger when you factor in our existing beliefs and biases. We tend to gravitate towards information that confirms what we already think.
It's like we're all living in echo chambers, filtering out anything that challenges our views.
That's a great way to put it. And Manson argues that this kind of thinking, it contributes to a lot of the problems we see in society, like all the outrage and polarization. We get so caught up in being right that we forget to listen to other perspectives.
That's kind of scary. Our own brains can sabotage us.
It can feel that way sometimes, but there are things we can do to combat it. Manson suggests cultivating a healthy skepticism of our own thoughts, especially the ones that are super emotionally charged.
So don't just blindly believe everything you think.
Exactly. Especially when those thoughts feel really, really strong, you gotta question them.
So more curiosity, less certainty.
You got it. He even says we should actively seek out information that challenges our beliefs, even if it feels uncomfortable.
So get out of our comfort zones and open our minds a little.
Exactly. The more we expose ourselves to different perspectives, the less likely we are to fall prey to, those biases that are baked into our thinking.
This reminds me of that experiment with the button and the light, where people started seeing patterns that weren't even there.
Oh, right. That one perfectly demonstrates how we crave meaning, even if we gotta make it up.
So basically, we're all prone to seeing patterns where there are none, and that can really mess with our beliefs.
Exactly. Which is why, self-awareness and critical thinking are so important. Now, Manson then goes on to discuss this thing he calls the responsibility fault fallacy.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. Break it down for me.
It's basically this. We often mix up fault and responsibility. Fault is about blame, like who caused the problem. Responsibility is about ownership, recognizing our role in the situation and what we can do about it.
So we might not be at fault for everything that happens, but we are always responsible for how we respond to it.
Yes, this is all about personal agency. The more responsibility we take, the more control we have over our lives.
It's like taking the wheel instead of just being a passenger.
I like that analogy. Manson uses this really powerful example. Imagine you find an abandoned baby on your doorstep. You obviously didn't cause that situation, but you are responsible for what happens to that baby.
Wow, that's a heavy example. but it definitely makes the point.
Right. We can't control everything that happens to us, but we can control how we react.
So it's an antidote to that whole victim mentality. Blaming everyone else just keeps you stuck.
Exactly. Manson says, own your problems and focus on finding solutions.
So focus on what you can actually influence, even if the circumstances suck.
Yep. And this leads into one of Manson's most practical principles, the do something principle.
All right, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
It's the idea that action often comes before motivation, not the other way around. Like, we usually wait to feel inspired before doing something, but Manson says just taking action, even small steps, can actually create that motivation.
So instead of waiting for the perfect time or feeling, we just need to get started, do something, anything.
Precisely. He talks about building his online business. He was terrified at first, had no idea what he was doing, but he forced himself to work, even when it felt pointless.
And eventually, that action led to inspiration and success.
Exactly. It's kind of like jump-starting a car. You need that initial burst of energy to get things moving.
This is great. What are some ways our listeners can use this in their own lives?
Well, let's say you're feeling totally overwhelmed by a creative project. Don't wait for inspiration to strike. Just sit down and write a paragraph, even if it's terrible. That small action can break the dam and get your creative juices flowing.
Or if you're dreading going to the gym, just put on your workout clothes. That could be enough to get you out the door.
You got it. Break those big, scary tasks into smaller, doable steps.
Just like that old saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
And every step you take, even the tiny ones, brings you closer to your goal.
Speaking of journeys, Manson also gets into relationships, right? He talks a lot about the importance of boundaries.
He does. He argues that good, healthy relationships, they need clear boundaries. Each person is responsible for their own emotions and their own needs.
So it's not about trying to control or fix each other, but respecting each other's space and individuality.
Exactly. He contrasts this with those unhealthy victim and savior dynamics, where one person always wants to be rescued and the other person thrives on feeling needed.
And those relationships tend to become codependent, don't they? They keep people stuck in their insecurities.
Exactly. Manson suggests that this dynamic often comes from a sense of entitlement. You know, that belief we talked about earlier that we deserve to be happy all the time, even if it means other people have to suffer for it.
And we learned that that kind of thinking just sets us up for disappointment because life is going to have ups and downs no matter what.
Right. He emphasizes that setting boundaries is all about saying no to things that don't align with your values and your needs. It's about protecting your emotional well-being, creating space for you to be authentically you.
I love that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. We got to take care of ourselves first before we can really be there for others.
Manson illustrates this beautifully with that story from his travels to Russia, where he really experienced the power of just being honest and upfront.
Oh, yeah, that culture shock moment. Tell me more about that.
So he realized that Russians, they're just super direct. You know, they'll tell you exactly what they think without worrying about being polite or offending you. It was a big contrast to how people interact in the West, where everyone's always trying to be so careful not to upset anyone.
That sounds kind of freeing, though, doesn't it?
It was, and it made Manson realize how important it is to just accept rejection. Once he let go of that need to please everyone, he felt so much more free to be himself.
That makes sense. Fear of rejection can really keep us from being our true selves.
It totally can. It can make us say yes to things we don't want and avoid difficult conversations that might actually help us grow.
We end up prioritizing this facade of harmony over our own needs, and that just doesn't work in the long run.
Right. And it brings us back to Manson's point about choosing our struggles wisely. Sometimes the struggle we need to embrace is the discomfort of saying no, of setting those boundaries that allow us to live a more genuine and fulfilling life.
This has been an incredible conversation. We've talked about so much, from believing bullshit to setting boundaries.
Yeah.
It's really making me think.
It's all connected, right? And it all comes back to Manson's core message: taking responsibility for your life, being intentional about your values, and letting go of all the things that don't truly matter.
It's like a blueprint for living with intention and purpose, for creating a life that reflects who you really are, flaws and all.
Exactly. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll tie everything together and see how these seemingly separate ideas create a powerful roadmap for personal growth and fulfillment.
So we've really explored some deep ideas, from the subtle art of not giving a feck.
We have, from facing our own mortality to picking our battles and embracing responsibility, setting boundaries.
It's a lot to take in, but I think I'm seeing how it all comes together.
Let's try to connect the dots, right?
Mhm.
At its heart, Manson's saying we need to focus on what truly matters.
He's encouraging us to, shed those worries and anxieties that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things.
Precisely. It's about recognizing our limitations, even embracing them instead of chasing this impossible ideal of perfection.
That reminds me of Manson's story about visiting the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa.
Ah, yes, standing on the edge of that cliff, literally confronting his fear of death.
Intense. What did he take away from that experience?
Well, he realized that by facing our mortality head on, we get this new perspective on life.
Like suddenly all those little worries just seem so insignificant.
Exactly. And that realization can unlock a sense of freedom and courage.
We can face challenges knowing that even failures are just, part of the journey.
Manson even suggests that reminding ourselves of our inevitable end can actually help us grow.
It sounds kind of dark, but I get it.
It's about savoring the present moment and doing things that truly matter.
And that goes back to like choosing our struggles. It's not about avoiding problems altogether. It's about choosing the right ones to face.
Exactly. And those struggles become meaningful when they align with our values, when they push us toward the life we want.
Like a mountain climber who enjoys the challenge of the climb, knowing that the summit is just a moment in time.
The real fulfillment's in the journey itself, pushing past our limits.
Which brings us back to that idea of responsibility, owning our choices and our emotions.
Remember that distinction between fault and responsibility.
Right. We might not be to blame for every bad thing that happens, but we are responsible for how we handle it.
And that empowers us, gives us control even when things are tough.
It's about being the driver, not just the passenger.
Manson firmly believes that owning our problems is the key to finding solutions.
Instead of playing the blame game, focus on what you can actually change, your own responses and actions.
And that can be so freeing.
So let's recap some of the big takeaways from this deep dive. That whole believing bullshit thing was really eye-opening.
The idea that our brains can mislead us.
It's crazy to think that our brains prioritize making sense of things, even if it means distorting reality.
That need for coherence can overshadow the truth, leading us to create stories that just reinforce what we already believe.
We build these echo chambers, shutting out anything that challenges us.
Manson uses that example of Meredith Moran, the journalist who made up a memory, to illustrate this point.
It shows how even our memories can be unreliable, influenced by our beliefs.
So how can we protect ourselves from these mental traps?
Well, Manson says we need to develop a healthy skepticism of our own thoughts.
Especially the ones that are fueled by strong emotions.
We got to take a step back and ask, is this really true, or is it just my emotions talking?
Embracing doubt and uncertainty can actually help us understand the world better.
He even encourages us to seek out information that challenges our beliefs, even when it's uncomfortable.
Real intellectual growth requires us to push past our comfort zones, engage with different viewpoints.
Expand our horizons, break free from those self-imposed limits.
And that ties into the importance of setting boundaries, learning to say no.
Manson argues that healthy relationships are built on clear boundaries, respecting each other's space.
It's about taking care of your own well-being without trying to control or fix other people.
He compares this to that unhealthy dynamic of victims and saviors, where one person's always needing to be rescued.
These patterns usually stem from a sense of entitlement, that belief that we're owed constant happiness, even at the expense of others.
And that, as we learned, just sets us up for disappointment.
Setting boundaries is all about saying no to things that don't serve us, protecting our emotional well-being.
It's about prioritizing ourselves, recognizing that we can't help others if we're depleted.
And each time we say no, we're actually saying yes to something else, something more aligned with our true selves.
It's like consciously choosing where we invest our time and energy.
Which brings us back to that fundamental principle, not giving a feck about things that don't matter.
It's about letting go of those superficial anxieties and external validations.
Choosing our battles, our values, our struggles with intention.
This has been an amazing journey. We've delved into some really profound concepts, from the subtle art of not giving a feck.
From facing our fear of death to embracing responsibility.
It's a powerful reminder that we have the power to shape our own experiences, even in a world that can feel chaotic.
And as we wrap up, let's distill 10 key takeaways.
All right, hit me with them.
Number 1, death is inevitable. Use that knowledge to focus on what truly matters.
2, happiness comes from solving problems, not running from them.
3, define your values. Make sure they're grounded in reality.
4, embrace the power of no. Set healthy boundaries to protect yourself and your energy.
5. Your brain can play tricks on you. Question your assumptions and be skeptical.
6. Action often comes before motivation. Don't wait for inspiration, just get started.
7. Failure is just part of the process. Use it as an opportunity to learn and grow.
8. Take responsibility for your emotions and your actions, even when it's tough.
9. Don't let the fear of death control your life. Savor the present moment.
And 10. Choosing to care about things that truly matter is the key to a more fulfilling life.
There you have it, a roadmap for navigating life with intention, authenticity, and a healthy dose of not giving a feck.
What a fantastic deep dive. If you haven't read Mark Manson's book, I highly recommend it. It's thought-provoking and empowering.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep choosing what matters most.
And remember, the subtle art of not giving a fake isn't about apathy. It's about intentionally directing your energy toward what aligns with your values and aspirations.